Hi everyone, I'm Duna. We're here at Mutant Watch again for an episode about ex-villains and not so villains. And we have here today Travis,
Hey.
Gabriel,
Hello.
and Gail.
Hi.
And today we're gonna talk about those villains of the X-Men comics that are like ethically difficult to define or that are really not villains or maybe not. And as always, before the show, I like to give a little shout out to the Black Lives Matter movement because it's still happening, even if less people talk about that now. And you can still find ways to help, way to join the protests if they're in your town, and way to support in other ways, donating, signing petitions, etc. in the link that is below me, that is blacklivesmatters.card.co. And once we have that, okay, let's go into the show. First of all, I wanna ask every one of you for your favorite X-Men villain overall before we enter into the whole stuff of those of some X-Men villains are really villains or not. Before that, what is your favorite one? Even if it's like a really bad guy one, I suppose. And whoever wants to go first with that one.
So I'll go.
I'll take it first.
Sure.
Go for it. You can have it.
Okay. So I'm going to open it up a little bit more, and not just particularly X-villain, but my favorite mutant villain, who is not necessarily a villain, but still a villain. And I wore the shirt today. Is Namor, the Submariner, and I figure, he's a villain because he has caused huge damage and killed people and terrorist acts, but at the same time, it's mostly retaliation to America or other surface nations attacking him or attacking his people, or him believing that that's true. And so most of his villainous actions, I think, are not justified, but understandable in that way.
Okay, that's a really good one.
So my favorite villain isn't so much I don't like it as the villain, but to me it's the best villain of the X-Men is actually humankind. Just because they are the biggest evil the X-Men have ever faced and the one that most people can relate to the most.
I completely agree with that one in the X-Men context. And what's your one, Gail? Maybe she's having issues with her microphone again. We have this one. I'm gonna carry it. Gail, if you hear me, whenever you want to jump in, just jump in. Okay, so my favorite is, I'm gonna answer probably the same thing to a lot of questions. I think my favorite is still Magneto after all of these years of searching for a lot of others and after being the first one that I was really invested in before even I read the comics. But I think it's mostly because I think he's very understandable when he does difficult things, when he does bad things, when he does good things, which happens a lot also when he I don't know how to explain it, but I think except for a little part of the comics when they try to put him into the very villain, only villain part again in the 90s, the rest of the Magneto stuff has been like a journey that a lot of people can relate to. And I like him because of that. And I think that carries out to the next question. I think I'm going to talk more about this in a while, but I think the next question is, who's your favorite one that is not really a villain, that is ethically difficult to consider a villain. And I think Travis already answered that, but Gabriel didn't.
I think I want to fall in maybe with Mystique for that one, because she fights for in a way to kind of protect herself and her people, and that is as I can get, even though her methods may be a bit more extreme than what normal people would be okay with. But in the end, she is fighting to try and protect herself, her family, her wife, her kids, her people. Um, so even though she is often clearly cut as the villain, it's usually the best in a way that's like I can kind of get where she's coming from.
Well, I know
I
I'm kind of forgiving of Mystique too because she is canonically mentally ill, and I think you have to make allowances for that in terms of behavior. Doesn't necessarily make the behavior good, but it does make it more understandable, or contextualizes it.
I think Mystique would be my favorite one if I didn't have such problems with a lot of parts of how Mystique is portrayed. Like I remember I have reread just the comics in which Magneto turns himself to the, I think it's the United Nations for a court of rule, and he just like says, I'm gonna turn myself for all the bad things that I done. I'll let people judge me. And in that comic that is in Uncanny X-Men 200, the comic before that has Mystique like trying to turn Magneto. And I think one of the things that I come to realize with Mystique is that a lot of things are readily done with her, but the thing about her being a villain is really like sometimes it's nonsense. Sometimes it makes sense, but other times it's like I don't know. It's just to fulfill the role that Mystique is a villain, like not making a lot of sense in the story, especially around that part, that freedom. I don't know what was the name. Freedom, liberation. I don't know the name of
Freedom
the.
Force.
Oh yeah.
Yes. Okay. So that part of the story felt too much like we need to do Mystique do be pro-government, that do justify evil things for the government, and I didn't really buy it a lot. Like it really didn't work for me. So I think Mystique is one of my favorite characters, but I'm not sure if it's one of my favorite in the way she's a villain. Like I understand Magneto more in that way, personally, but I just love her. I think people need to have empathy for Mystique. I don't know if that makes sense. Like what Travis said, like, okay, she sometimes doesn't make sense, but she also sometimes it's a very person that has suffered a lot and is just trying to get other people close to her to suffer the less possible. That happens a lot. Um, okay, so getting more into this one, I have thought of some of examples of this thing that has happened. Oh, wait, we have a comment. So before we're gonna get to the comment, because this is an interesting one. Okay, so Kerfi Blackner, who was in the last show, commented on the YouTube and said that he loves Mr. Sinister as a villain, and because he's extreme in a way he doesn't think anyone else is. And because he's a scientist, he's obsessed with the Summer's bloodline. I suppose that is kind of mutant purity or something like that. And I don't know. I remember Travis did a great article in a version of Sinister that was in the past times that was really interesting. I don't know if any of you want to say anything about Sinister.
So yeah, I really like that Further Adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix mini, and I was very happy to see Peter Milligan, who wrote it, comment recently that it was his favorite non-ecstatics X-Men comic that he wrote. And I like it a lot because Sinister is way melodramatic about it. That name alone, it's a very silly name even for a supervillain. He is Mr. Sinister, and he runs an orphanage. And, in the comic, they kind of explore that he's acting out in a big way. He's coming out of this mid-19th century sort of storm and thunder, gothic melodrama. And so when he names himself Sinister, it's to psych himself into being a villain. He's constantly saying things like, I know this is evil, but maybe it's not evil enough. I have to be the worst person ever because that will make things happen. And that's a very different motivation than I am justified in everything, or I'm the good guy here, why don't you see it? Is someone who knows that they're doing wrong, but they're doing it almost to make themselves a mockery, or almost to push up people into confronting them.
I completely agree. I feel like Mr. Sinister is so unbelievably extra that you can't help but enjoy him. I struggle with picking my favorite villain because a lot of the X-villains I like better as heroes. But then you have Mr. Sinister, who is just so deliberately, intentionally evil that I can't picture him ever really being a hero. And unlike the Juggernauts, the Magnetos, the Emma Frost, and everyone else who had a turn at villainy, Mr. Sinister is just Mr. Sinister and forever will be that.
I also remember, this may be so super random, but I remember this political compass thing with X-Men villains. I just remember it because I remember obviously in the authoritarian left was Magneto, and I remember that Mr. Sinister was probably one of those two places, but based on the fact that he was like basically into eugenics, like that was his whole point. Mm-hmm. His whole point is to trying to design a perfect mutant or a perfect being, and that lives forever. And it's like I think it's an interesting concept, and I think it's funny the thing that about like being like purposely evil for that. And I think, I don't know, it happens very few with X-Men villains. Most of them have very reasoning behind. I'm thinking now of Apocalypse, because I just think a lot of Apocalypse later, because he's like in this role right now, because he's supposedly not a villain anymore. We suppose we are led to believe that, and and I don't know. I think of that because even Apocalypse has this whole thing of I'm just trying to bring the best for my people. Like he has this whole thing behind, even if it's in the wrong way possible, because it's like by highlighting the best mutants or something like that. But it's like this justification, and I think it happens a lot in the X-Men comics. And
I really like in Blood of Apocalypse, where Apocalypse is he's basically a TV preacher. He's a televangelist. And he comes out on the podium and, addresses the masses of mutants with, I will, raise you all up and we will all be in this together kind of thing. And it made me look at older Apocalypse stories and kind of recontextualize them in that framework, that he is a guy who really believes this kind of messianic, ideology, which explains some of the irrational stuff that he does. Because a lot of his stories, especially the early stories, don't make a whole lot of sense when you put them together. But looking at it as a religious thing, like he is the religious X-Men villain, in a big way, to me at least.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Apocalypse is one that I've always kind of had a bit of a soft spot because of just his methodology and his ideology and just how he claims to seek to try to make mutants be the better race, and it makes for good stories. And his switch into now being this supposed hero, while not abandoning any of that, in the page of Excalibur, where he's still hiding secrets, he's experimenting on Morgan Le Fay and manipulating Richter into God knows what. It definitely makes for a good story. And I find myself always wanting Apocalypse to have some kind of logic, even if it's not always there.
Well, let me ask both of you, in terms of Excalibur, the fox hunting thing with the werewolves. To me, my question when that story was developing was, how does that not make them all supervillains?
Yeah.
Because the werewolves are intelligent, they are cognizant, living. They speak English, and the idea is that the longer they're in our world, they're losing their cognitive function. But if any of us had a stroke and we lost our cognitive function, and some very wealthy people from some island out in the middle of the Pacific were like, we're going to hunt you now and we're going to cook your bones for a spell, they would be bad people. But in the context of the story, it's treated very much like, well, they have lost their cognitive functions. They are no longer worthy of not being hunted, basically, and cooked into a magic stew.
I very much found those two issues to be very weird in tone, because it felt to me like it was made very clear that what they were doing wasn't really right, and like they kind of seemed to get the fact that they shouldn't be doing what they're doing, and I think Gambit was the one who vocalized it, but they still did it.
Yeah.
And like Captain Britain was like, it's fine, and it's not fine. There's nothing about this that is fine, and it felt really weird.
I think, just piggybacking on this last thing you say, Gabriel, I think it's funny that Gambit was the one to point that out, because the other example I yes, something about this. The other example of something like this happening in an X-Men comic where an X-Men behaves like a villain completely, even if it's from a theoretical perspective or practical perspective, more or less. It was when Gambit helped kill the Morlocks, and they were all kind of okay with that. Like there wasn't really a lot of discussion around that. There was some people that hated Gambit, rightfully, but like Gambit has been integrated into that, and that has been sometimes part of his story and sometimes not part of his story. In fact, I think some people do it very right. I remember for the last show, I was reading the Nation X series, and I found one of those was about Gambit, and it was really great because it was about regrets and about the monstrous things he has done. And I think sometimes that's just taken for granted. At least for the other X-Men, they're like, well, this thing happens, but they're Morlocks or something like that. Like that brings to there.
X-Men are very forgiving of their friends being involved in genocide. Colossus, when his sister dies, and his reaction is, well, I will go join a genocidal cult that lives in space. And, what is it, like 7 issues? So like 7 months. And then everyone's like, oh, well, come home. And even when he comes home, the first thing he does is beat up his ex-girlfriend's boyfriend because he found them making out on a hill. But they forgive him immediately, and he's a member of an X-Men team. And I think about that in terms of, real life, we would never. But even in terms of like a TV show where things are dramatic, it would be very hard to have a character join a genocidal cult for half a season and then come back and beat up somebody's boyfriend and put him in a wheelchair, and then say, now he's a member of the regular cast, and we all, we're going to go down to Pop's Diner and have sodas with him.
Depends on the show, but completely agree. Like, the X-Men are way too forgiving of most people, which I get it. It's an easy way to move the plot forward, but it just makes it stand out even more so when it's someone they're not that forgiving towards. So you have Emma Frost, who was a member of the good guys since Generation X started in I think it was 95. And then she, after Cyclops dies, and she does some very morally not good things, but then the entire everyone hates her for it for years to come. And it's like, a lot of X-Men have done worse things or as bad things, and it just gets swept under the rug, and they get welcomed back with open arms.
Yes, I think they have this superhero mentality, that they're like the superheroes, and then the rest of the mutants are like the rest of the mutants. And I don't know, I find this happens a lot with the Morlocks, and I wish it was more explicit in comics. Because I was watching the Morlock episodes. They have in the animated series, they have a Morlock little Xmas episode, and that episode is weird because it's like, we don't care about these people at all, but now one of them is hurting in a way that touches our identity, our way to see things, and then we suddenly care a lot, and it's Christmas. and the point at the end was like, sharing with Morlocks is fine, you have to share your food. And then they never see them again. And it's like, they have this whole like helping superhero big mentality that is not necessarily inherent to being a mutant in itself, but it's more about the X-Men.
I mean, one thing I thought was fascinating, and I don't know what Joe Casey, who was writing then, meant, but when he introduced Stacy X, who was a mutant sex worker, he had Angel constantly insulting her, Warren, and Angel owned the brothel that she worked at, but he's constantly getting down on her for being a sex worker in a brothel he owns. And Wolverine, trying to have heart-to-heart talks to talk her up, basically calls himself what Joe Casey called elsewhere the world's most raped man. And he does this, you see this uniform I'm wearing, this was the uniform they made me wear when they abused me, and now I wear it because I'm a different person. And he's trying to tell her this, like this is going to inspire her to stop acting out or doing, vigilante work on the side. And it doesn't work. It comes off as these guys who live in this mansion and haven't really had a straight job in forever, if ever, just, with personal fortunes, just lecturing this woman on her life. And neither of them have a great, leg to stand on. They've both murdered people. They've both been living a very kind of, they've had torture and had problems, but they've lived a financially sheltered life. They've lived a socially sheltered life in a big way. That we've seen them in X-Men, but they both feel they can completely tell this woman how to live her life and what's wrong with her. And I kind of found that fascinating as the pretension of the X-Men or the hypocrisy of the X-life.
I love that this show is turning into the villains are not so villains and the heroes are not so heroes. I think. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry. What Travis is saying, it really strikes me as like the older TV shows, how it has that very special episode where they go and they see what it's really like to live hard, and they impart their wisdom from their ivory tower. And both the Stacey X situation and the Morlock episode are pretty much that. It's like, oh, we need these people to feel like they know what they're talking about, and it really just makes it look like they know less what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay, so connecting with this one, and I think maybe to also, I want to ask you if you think there's any X-Men character that was temporarily or on a long run a villain and that didn't deserve to be seen as a villain. I have one. If you want to, if you want, I have one, and my one is Monet. And I think Monet was seen as a villain various times, even if people were like, "Oh, she's traumatized." Okay, but they still painted that on her, and that's probably I. As I was reading the Generation X new run for the other shows, I left this thing behind because I was talking about other things that were more important to the shows, like the queer stuff, no? But like I found that I don't know that Monet was very biased there, and it didn't make that much sense because she was mostly a victim of the name just blew up because of dyslexia, but her brother, empath. She was a
Emplate.
victim of emplate. Okay, emplate. Empath is another one. Emplate. She was a victim. She was a victim of emplate for the whole run, and still there was some of that was like Monet is acting as a villain, and that has happened a number of times. And they have kind of other characters have get mad at her, more like Jubilee more than anyone, but other characters also get mad at her, get distant at her for enhancing some actions that were done while she was being possessed by her brother, which is kind of unfair for the character. And I think it plays a lot into she's a brown woman and a Muslim, and she's like put in this position of villainy very easily by people, even subconsciously.
And I think that happens with like Karma. Karma would have storylines where, like, when she was possessed, and other younger mutants especially kind of took that out on her. Like, that was something she chose to have happen. She chose to be possessed. She chose to be used. And that was even coming up as far as Marjorie Liu's Astonishing X-Men, where people are still concerned about the nature of her powers and abuse. Rogue as a villain, when Rogue is introduced as a villain, I think there are people that still hold on to that and hold on to that, Ms. Marvel Rogue thing, as if Rogue was not very young when that happened, being raised by two supervillains. And Claremont, to his credit, does reiterate occasionally, even just a few years ago, how young Rogue was, or at least was meant to be, when she was introduced and a supervillain. So I think that's forgiving. To me, I would forgive somebody if they're like 17 and their parents are raising them to be this, mutant terrorist, and the world is out to get you. There's a little leeway if you spend the rest of your life doing good and trying to help people, which she has.
For me, I would actually say it would be all the times we have villains who become good guys, and then something happens. The X-Men as a group are always so quick to just wash their hands of the person and just be like, "Oh, I guess we have to fight you now." I think, like, for example, Juggernaut had been part of X-Men and he'd been part of New Excalibur, and then he embraced his powers more, partially to save the X-Men and also to prove he was stronger than the Hulk. And then they pretty much washed their hands of him after that. And even more recently with Omega Sentinel, last we saw Karima, she was walking off into the sunset to become a cop. And then Night stumbles into her among the bad guys, and it's literally like, "Oh, you're here. Okay, I guess you're a bad guy." Like, there was no, "Why are you doing this? Aren't we friends? What happened? Where's your hair?" It was just, "Hey, now we fight."
I mean, there's definitely a sense of the X-Men community, and I think also Magneto and his Brotherhood have a sense of a community that locks out other characters. And so you have characters like Amelia Voigt, who was working with Charles Xavier and was, his age and a professional. And she's not really into, hey, I'm going to take a bunch of teenagers, move them into my house, and they're going to fight for me. And so she tries to leave, and Charles Xavier psychically makes her stay for a moment. And so she cuts out on the whole thing, and then eventually becomes, she tries to do Magneto's thing when he has his cult and can't do that either. But I think the reason that she left is not so much, I don't believe in mutant unity. I don't believe in mutant, and human working together or whatever. It was that Charles didn't want somebody on his level. He wanted 5 teenagers to live with him, and he would tell them what to do. You see the same thing with Magneto and Astra. And Astra is kind of her own supervillain and got a lot of problems. But her main motivation for leaving the Brotherhood was it was a brotherhood. There's no women allowed kind of thing. And she felt cut out on that level. And so she goes off to space and becomes this inordinately powerful supervillain and comes back mainly to show Magneto that she's better than him. And he wins, so maybe she's not. But the motive comes out of that these are locked communities kind of founded by these, guys who are kind of ideologues, Charles and Magneto. If that makes sense.
Totally. In fact, I was going to ask you one of the other questions that I had there. I had for later, but I think it goes now. It's like all these names, I think, I don't know why, but I think putting something like the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants or the Mutant Liberation Front or all these things they do, it just makes them more appealing. Like, to me personally, it's like, okay, I want to know more about these people. Not, okay, these are the villains and I just get it, because we are in the context of comics that post mutants are as oppressed people. So when you see the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, you're like, they might be onto something. I don't know. Yes, go ahead.
I definitely agree, and I think that has to do with the changing times and changing political stances and ideological stances as we get older and as time goes. But I do know that as the older I get, the less I view the X-Men as the good guys, and the more I'm like, well, if this was real, maybe I might check out to see what Magneto's doing. Like, as long as he hasn't sent out any missiles anytime recently, maybe I'll sign up there. It just, the ideas behind it, if not the execution, the ideas behind it just starts to make more sense.
See, I'm the opposite. I just become hypercritical of all of them. Like, I'm still not forgiving Magneto for stuff he did.
You are stuck.
Back when he was, conquering peaceful nations and enslaving people. And, like, that's kind of, like, I'll let fictional murders go, like, sometimes ridiculously easy. But when it comes to fictionalized slavery or fictionalized eugenics experiments, they're a villain forever. I'm like, I don't, I will never follow that. Like, not like I have a choice to follow them. I'm not going to sign up, Magneto's not having a recruitment drive in real life. But reading it, I always will read those characters then on that level. Even if it's a character that's been a good guy or whatever for 15 years or 20 years. Those are kind of the places where I draw the line, is when there's genocide or slavery involved.
Okay, I think I can connect this with the little chat I want to have about Magneto. Because, like, I think most of the things, I'm not sure, because it was a long time since I've read the first run of X-Men, the 1963, so I don't remember what he did there. But in the in the 80s comics, Chris Claremont was trying to bring Magneto to a more empathetic point. That was, in fact, he says one of the reasons why he left X-Men was because they wanted to have Magneto as a classic villain, and he didn't want to. And he was like tired of trying to overwrite, no? Like, I write a scene, this person writes this other thing there, and pretty much everyone at Marvel was like, the correct way to go right now is to make Magneto an villain again, to have like an, I don't know, like a main X-Men villain to base the comics on. It was an editorial decision. So he left because of that. But while he was doing so, I think there's some interesting things. Is that a lot of people say that Chris Claremont, because he's Jewish, he was the first person that was like, Magneto is Jewish, but he was very explicitly trying to paint in Magneto not something concrete, but a person that has survived the Holocaust. He was doing that in general. He didn't specifically say Jewish. In fact, when people asked him, he was like, I wanted to include other people that could have been in that situation. So the editors and Malver piggyback onto that and make Magneto a Roma survivor of the Holocaust for some years in the 90s. And I think it was pretty coincidental with the worst stuff that he did. And I think that's also to make criticism of, like, they're trying to make Magneto a, oh, he survived an Holocaust, so he's doing the same thing, kind of rhetoric. And I find hard to fall into that when I know there has been a lot of trying to get this character in another different road. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, I think there. I mean, there's a lot of see with Magneto going. You know, no matter how you look at him, whether you think that he's a straight out villain, whether you think that he's a good person who has done bad things. I think he's hypocritical on basic levels. Him and Charles having tea together, he's going to say something that is not entirely accurate, but paints himself in a better picture. So, like, I liked recently when they kind of remade him as a Jew, that he had been Romani for a lot of the 90s and early 2000s. And their position is that he chose that as a false identity because he was ashamed of his actions during World War II and when he was in a camp, and that he was also trying not to throw his own people under a bus. And in order to not throw Jewish people under that bus, he picked a whole other ethnic group and threw them under the bus, that's a flawed character. That's to me, even at his best, Magneto screws up in some way. When he was a good person in the 80s, Louise Simonson still wrote him doing some very bad things. The Avengers versus X-Men miniseries, where they deal with his trial, and he's got a machine that will make everybody vote that he was not a bad person. Right? That paints a very bad picture that I think Claremont did not want. I don't think Claremont was on board with those portrayals at that time. But it makes him a much more interesting character to me, too.
Kind of like what Duna was saying, how they tried to revert him back to the main villain. One of the comments actually says that they forgot how on the nose Brotherhood of Evil Mutants was, and I feel like that's sometimes what they try to do with Magneto is just make him into this cardboard cutout of villainy, as opposed to the more fleshed out, complex character that he is. And that's what really it irks me when they just try to make him the most evilest person, but a lot of work went in to add that depth, like what Duna was saying during the Claremont phase, where they tried to add more to him, add a logic behind what he did, and then to just kind of wipe that aside, it never resonated with me.
I really liked Zornito when Magneto was Zorn, because Zorn was everything we wanted in a good Magneto. He was, trying to help children. He felt persecuted. He's trying to do better now. And when he's acting as Magneto in that storyline, he's everything we don't want to see in Magneto. It's the big speeches and the lazy murder and the supervillainy in that big, just cardboard way. And even he knew it. Even he, having conversations with himself, was realizing they all want him to be a good person. He could just be that good person. And he was so petty about it. And he needed to be in power. He needed to be justified. And that's all that led to the villainy, really, was that he needed to feel justified. We're not meant in that storyline to be like, yay, we're glad Magneto is wearing a cape again and he's taking over a city. It really was a tragedy of he could just stop now and be this decent guy. And, maybe he's a little out of touch, but everybody liked him more. Scott liked him. The kids liked him. Charles liked him again.
I don't know why, but I see all of this as kind of a tragedy that is filled with like burning in the fire of editorial mandates. Because it's like we could have this one of the other one, but Magneto is just a mess right now. I think for some reasons I'm especially mad at the turn of the 90s of full villainy. We had another comment about Asta not seeing Magneto being an outright villain, like that would never work. And I think it doesn't work. I think it works better when they're not trying to play Magneto as an outright villain, but as a complicated character. But as Travis said, there is a point that becomes when you can like undo so much canon stuff. Like there's a lot of evil, no more like evil, more like morally wrong stuff done by Magneto. So you have to reconcile that with the vision that I don't know that he's a somewhat, I think, redeemable character.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. I'm Team Magneto a lot, so I'm probably just like pushing my own vision of having a character that is an X-Men and that is nor was an X-Men but a mutant that is explicitly oppressed in other ways and talking about it and talking about being a mutant too, and that touches me. So I'm like, I want to see nuance Magneto. But yeah, I think some of the nuances also are like the things that he has done wrong. Mm-hmm. I don't know. And to move into, okay, do you both read the last Giant Size Magneto this 1 week? Because I think we should maybe say something about it. I don't have a lot to say. I don't have a lot to say. Oh, okay. I'm not sure if Gabriel was on a talk.
I haven't read it, so it will be you two.
Gabriel, we're not hearing you. I don't know if you're mute. Wait. Technical issues. Okay, I'm gonna do this. Okay, Gabriel is gone for a moment, so we'll be back to that theme. I'm gonna save that one for when Gabriel is here.
I'm very disappointed in the giant size one shot that have come out, so I kind of skipped this one.
It's good. I was disappointed too in the other ones. I was like at this one. Okay, Gabriel is here. We haven't got time to change the subject yet.
I have not read Giant Size Magneto yet, so I'm not going to have too much to add for this one. So y'all probably could have continued without me.
No, nobody has read it except me, and all I have to say is it was okay. It was okay. I'd like to see Magneto being like soft and sweet That thing I like. It's very soft and sweet through all of it, but the story was mm, like the other ones. Okay, so getting on the other dance, I just let it like the other ones. Okay, so I just talk about this redemption arc of Magneto. So I want to ask you both if you have another character that you like that has a redemption arc or something like that. Another villain that is redempted.
I actually really like Juggernaut's redemption arc. Um, he came about and joined the X-Men in an arc that I'm mostly not a fan of overall, but the way he came about first with Sammy Pear and building that friendship, and then Sammy dying, and Juggernaut choosing to fight for the X-Men over his longest friend, Black Tom Cassidy, and then coming back after that and going straight onto Excalibur and making that bond with Nocturne and with Dazzler. I felt like it worked really well, um which is why it angers me. Like, but then you get like the Iceman solo where he's fighting Iceman, and the fact that he was a hero not too long ago is just never even acknowledged.
Hmm. Yeah, I also like Juggernaut a lot. I think in the X-Men Black, Juggernaut was after the X-Men one, so that's kind of confusing because they kind of addressed that in the X-Men Black one. I didn't like the X-Men Black ones, except the Juggernaut one,
I
and
thought they
it was sadly about that. So they struck it off to later put it there again.
No, I really like the Chuck. I like the Chuck Austin X Men more than I think most X fans. In a lot of ways, Nurse Annie was a big thing for me because I saw myself in Nurse Annie in some sad ways and some good ways. But the Juggernaut thing there was that he wasn't really a super villain. Like you don't see Juggernaut like robbing a lot of banks or hacking NORAD or whatever or conquering a country. He is just a big angry guy. And so giving him, a kid that he can relate to and have to restrain himself for, and a situation where he has to be civil to people. He's got to be civil to North Star. He's got to be civil to Iceman. It was fun for me. I don't know that I necessarily forgive him some, his earlier abuses, but I think it was a good road that he was on. A lot of the ex-villains, when they rehabilitate them, I'm kind of always waiting for them to lapse back. I think Magneto was probably the first time I was really burned on that, where he's starting to be a good guy, and now, in 1991, he's this big villain again. So my assumption is they're going to default and be a villain again. I guess Banshee Banshee was introduced as a villain, and he hasn't really gone villain again since. So we'll give you Banshee's been the longest term for that. But most of them, they like not really being like a criminal, I guess, but they like acting out, clearly, the ex-villains. Mystique likes acting out. Sauron likes acting out so much that he named himself after the bad guy in Lord of the Rings. That's like Mr. Sinister. That's not really being a terrible person. That's being a terrible nerd. And nerd lashing out, which I think is a lot of, Blob was a wrestler who kept being bothered by the X-Men or bothered by Magneto, and then he's acting out and doing these big, big things. Before they bothered him, he just seems to have just been this wrestler. So they're not really like criminal masterminds in that way. A lot of the ex-villains, the ones who are, government people or something like God Loves Man Kills or something like that.
Yeah, no, the usual villains are like hard people most times. I kind of like that, even if it falls into tropes. Sometimes you can find yourself in some part of it.
Yeah.
And I think with Lost Gabriel, we're having a lot of technical issues today. So sorry for the people watching. That is, I'm in and out because I'm trying to fix things. But I think we can try to close with. Since I think Gabriel isn't gonna be able to come back, I think we can try to close with making some kind of, I don't know, villain story you would like to read, or villain team you would like to see, or things you would like to see in the future. Especially because, like, right now it's a weird moment for villains, in especially mutant villains, because nobody is a villain supposedly. All mutants are good, and and I don't know. I guess that could be an interesting then. Like, what do you want to see done in the future, in future runs or teams or whatever?
Well, I dropped out of most of the current X titles, and a big part of that was I read the House of X, Powers of X when it was coming out, and that council that they set up to me was a supervillain team. I don't see that council as a good thing because the majority of the power on that council is in the hands of people who've committed mass murder, the hands of people who have, tried to conquer the world, kind of like the big villains. Mr. Sinister's on there and Apocalypse is on there. And they give Emma Frost a seat. And we had just seen with the X-Men Black, which I really didn't like most of the X-Men Black titles, but I like that Emma Frost put, Shaw and everything behind her and dealt with that. And the first thing they tell her is if you're going to be on the council, Shaw has to share your power and you can pick one more seat. And why Shaw? What does he offer the world except being a rich white guy who abuses women? This is what Sebastian Shaw has to offer the world. And they gave him a seat on their government over like anybody. And the only good people on it were like when they have Storm and Jean over in one house, and Charles keeps calling them my children, the children. And so the only good people they put on that council are people that Charles Xavier willingly calls children repeatedly. And so to me, that's the supervillain story. And I'm waiting for that to blow up. Like, I will go back and buy every issue and read it all if at the end of this, that council all turns out to be evil and Krakoa goes nuts and Krakoa has been the supervillain of it all or something like that. Then I will, eat my words and eat crow, and I'll buy every issue and apologize to Hickman. But right now, I've checked out on pretty much everything except Excalibur because it felt too much villainous without being, while being treated as heroic or treated as this great social movement of, they're empowering themselves by having a council full of wealthy supervillains.
I completely agree about just the council being the villains, except the only piece I disagree is Krakoa did no harm. Krakoa was just trying to live their life, being a happy island and eating mutants' brains. I think the true villain is Charles Xavier himself. I've been saying that since he came back to life and hijacked Phantom X's body. X is a villain. He gives me bad, creepy vibes, and I'm just waiting for that shoe to drop.
Okay.
I kind of jumped in a little bit. I believe we're talking about like our villain team we would want to read.
Yeah.
I would love to see the Reavers come back with Lady Deathstrike. And I would actually like to see Daken be involved with that because it seems like the kind of self-mutant hating thing he would join. I'll also go a little bit further, and I think that would be the perfect villain for Richter and Shatterstar in that series I want them to be in, written by Steve Orlando.
Okay. We're the official sponsors of Steve Orlando's Richter and Shatterstar series. Which
It's
is
my
gonna
personal
come
crusade.
someday. It's gonna come someday because we're pitching it constantly. Okay, I found that very interesting. The thing of the council being all villains. I think I it's the first time I think about it. Not because I haven't think is weird. But because I have seen the Krakoa scene being more about mutant rights and everything, and I haven't realized that the council is filled with people that have done really terrible things for mutant in the past. I didn't realize that the government is like that, even if like the idea is really pretty good. Like the execution is like the government is filled with these people that have done this, and the exceptions, like you say, are like saviors prodigies or something like that. Except, if you count Mystique, because it's kind of going against it all right now, it seems. I hope they follow with that. That was like the issue that got me interested. When I started reading, the issue that was like, oh, maybe I keep reading this, was when Mystique, when like, I want my wife back. Or and she was like, I'm gonna burn it all. And that stuff was like very great. Also because it poses a real dilemma. Like, this is a good thing for most mutants, but it's not a good thing for all mutants because they don't have like some people there because they can see the future. And
I'm not really sold on it is a good thing for them. I think they believe it might be, but I'm very pro get Mystique her wife back.
Yeah, it's very. Is it good or is it good? Like, there's a lot that the general population does not know. So there's a lot more to it, or whether or not maybe it's not good.
I think it's easy for them. And I also feel, in terms of character, I don't know if the writers right now are intended or not, but I can see a lot of that council, particularly Charles and Magneto, having grudges against Mystique. And they are kind of petty. I would not put it past them to not resurrect Destiny just because it hurts Mystique.
I mean, they didn't resurrect Rafaldine, so like, and maybe there's someone else. I don't know where the fuck is Legion right now, which is a question that I have been having for a while. He's just in that universe doing his things.
I feel like that was a question well before House of X and Power of X. What happened to him? He just pops in and out.
Yeah, but in the Uncanny X-Men run with Ed Brinson, he was like a main part of it, and the Age of X-Men, he was a big part of it, and then when they came back, he disappeared. And that strikes me weird, like, the other person that has a loved one that is a precognitive is David Haller. So, like, why is he not like in Move Mystique? Like, especially because Ruth. I mean, the story of Ruth is like very crude. I didn't like it at all, and I don't wanna get a lot into the theme because it's very triggering. But it's safe to say that this was an unfair death, and goes by a lot of people that are now in positions of power in Krakoa. So, like, I don't know. It feels like I would like for them to touch into that. I wouldn't even mind if they get Legion back and make him a villain again just to show this. I'm tired of this kind of stuff because I prefer runs in which Legion is complex. The Cyspher run is great, and I think he's one of those villains that is not really like a villain but a complex person, and I like a lot of what Cyspher did with him. So I prefer that, but I wouldn't mind if they bring back him as an adversary, not necessarily a villain, for like closing some of the dots that are not closed right now. I know it's difficult to close all continuity, but it's weird that in Matthew Rosenberg's run this was also important, and right now it's not.
Yeah, I feel like part of that was intentional. Like, I got the impression that when Hickman took over, he made that time jump, I think it was a year, for the sole purpose of not having to address any continuity he didn't want to address, which I can get the logic of it being a good jumping in point for new readers, but I feel like it robbed us as the readers of some really good, interesting points of these reunions, of, you know, all these people now being alive again, and us not really getting much out of it, of being able to see them together again.
So can I ask everybody to touch on, Gabe, what you said about Charles? How do we feel about Charles as a villain? Because he's done a lot of bad things, especially if like Morrison and Claremont both made it clear that Casanova is Charles Xavier, that you know, that conquistador hat wearing astral projection, whose name I forget, the entity, is Charles Xavier. So Charles Xavier has been a rapist. Charles Xavier has been a mass murderer. Charles Xavier has been, you know, he's manipulated the minds of his students and his closest friends to make them forget relatives that they have, to forget that people died, to, you know, all sorts of things over the years. Is he really a supervillain at that point? Okay.
Positive.
I know that Jordan Wright, I believe, is doing a read-through of Uncanny X-Men from issue 1, and like he's tweeting commentary about it, and it reminded me of things that I completely forgot about. Like in the first 3 issues, both Vanisher and Blob, Professor X's answer to it is, let's just wipe everyone's mind. Like, and he's like constantly invading the thoughts of his own students. Like he'll like snap at them when they answer a question, and he'll be like, I already know the answer, I read your mind. And he is a creepy person, and that isn't even touching his infatuation with you know, 16-year-old Jean Grey. He's a creep, and I think he's always been a villain. Just he's been making people think he's not.
Yeah.
I think that's fair, and I think the whole thing about Xavier's dreams always passed wrong in my head. Like, it's something weird. Like, why the dream of this man concretely? I think Gabriel said it all. He's 100% a villain, and I mean, I hope it gets treated like that in this run, but we don't know. But okay, so we arrive here to, I think, close the end. What we got is that Saber is definitely a villain, and we are not sure if Magneto and Mystique and Emma Frost and Juggernaut are really villains, and I can stand by that. I mean, sometimes.
Xavier is morally evil. Everyone else is in that in-between space.
Well, I always say, it depends on the writer. It depends on the year.
And I may be misremembering, but I feel like when House of X, Powers of X started, Hickman had stated that it's a story about 100 of mutants and 99 villains. And if I may be remembering it wrong, but in my head, it's been that one is Mystique as she's trying to burn it all down.
Okay, I like that.
That's a really okay. I was like,
I think
people should click in this video just because of that.
I have been waiting for a Mystique rehabilitation in that way, because it really bothered me during the Bendis run, the way that she was, particularly with the Dazzler stuff.
Yeah.
And some of the things that she was on board with Sabretooth. She and Sabretooth have their own weird thing. It is whatever. But it takes it away from me from where I want her character to be, or where I'm more comfortable with her character being. So I'm all for what you're saying about her being the one.
The one hero of the X-Men of Dawn of X.
Yes.
Yeah, and also the whole Cassandra and Cassandra. I remember their name right. And Charles being the same person always struck to me as really bad.
Mhm.
Like I understand it's what Claremont intended in the end and all that stuff,
Mhm.
but it always struck to me as I don't know more queer coding. I'm sorry I had to say queer coding in this show too. I think I have to say it in every show, but it's X-Men. We're gonna get used to it.
Mhm.
Mhm.
But yeah. Okay, so I think that is all for this one show.
Mhm.
And I hope everyone enjoyed, even in the moments when we are like technical issues, technical issues. I'm I'm sorry we couldn't have Gail finally, but we're gonna try to get her to other shows and more people. And the next one is gonna be on the 1st of August, like opening the month, and it's gonna be on X Factor because X Factor releases the week before, and I'm gonna do some rereading that I'm gonna really enjoy. And thank you everyone for coming. Thank you Travis, thank you Gabriel a lot, and bye.
Bye.